I have pushed the record button, so we are now fully recording. Good evening, everyone. My name is Calvin Hill, and I serve as the Vice President for Inclusion and Community Engagement here at Springfield College. Welcome to tonight's program on recognizing Indigenous pasts, presents, and futures, a conversation on land acknowledgements. This evening, we will have a fireside chat. Our first hour will be a moderated conversation, while our final 30 minutes will be held for questions from our audience. Please use the Q&A function when directed. To get our evening started, Dr. Mary Beth Cooper, President of Springfield College, will read a land acknowledgement. Dr. Cooper.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Welcome, everybody. I'm so delighted to see so many of you here tonight, and I am deeply honored to begin tonight's program reading a land acknowledgement. Let me just say before I begin that I have been working on getting more proficient in my pronunciation of many of the tribe names, and I promise to get better and better, but I am deeply, deeply honored to read the land acknowledgement this evening. So I begin. We acknowledge that Springfield College stands on the traditional homelands of the Indigenous Algonquian people known as Agawam. The Agawam were closely related and diplomatically connected to the Quabog to the east, the Podunk to the south, the Woronoco to the west, and the Non-Otuk, Pocatuck, and Sokiki to the north. We acknowledge the memory of these indigenous nations who, after having inhabited this land for more than 10,000 years, were displaced in the 1600s to 1700s by English colonial settlers who exploited native generosity and provoked warfare. We acknowledge the surviving native nations on what is now called New England, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and the Pequot and the Scattecoke to the south, the Mohegan to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. We affirm, honor, and respect the sovereignty of those hundreds of other Native American nations across North America that survive today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. It is now my privilege to introduce the first of our speakers, Dr. Margaret Bruchac. After I introduce Dr. Margaret Bruchac, my colleague and friend, student, Jahlina Carter, will introduce Ms. Anderson. Dr. Bruchac is an associate professor of anthropology, coordinator of Native American Indigenous Studies, and consulting scholar to the American section of the Penn Museum at the University of Pennsylvania. In her multimodal career as a performer, ethnographer, historian, and museum consultant, Dr. Bruchac has long been committed to critical studies of colonial histories, archives, and museums, while developing interpretations of Indigenous histories and challenging erasures and stereotypes. She has also long served as a consultant to museums. Locally, these include Historic Deerfield, Old Sturbridge Village, and Historic Northampton. Dr. Bruchac has received research awards from the American Philosophical Society, the Ford Foundation, and the School for Advanced Research, among others. Her 2018 book, Savage Kin, Indigenous Informants and the American Anthropologist, received the inaugural Council for Museum Anthropology Book Award. Dr. Bruchac also directs a restorative research project, the Wampum Trail, that focuses on the histories, meaning, and materiality of wampum objects over time. We are so glad to have you here with us, Dr. Bruchac. Jahlina?
Our next panelist is Ms. Rhonda Anderson. She is Inupiaq of Abaskin from Alaska, and her native enrollment village is Katovik. Her life works are most importantly as a mother, a classically trained herbalist, silversmith, and activist. Rhonda has sat on several Indigenous panels and roundtables to discuss how to implement the Hyde Amendment within all IHS institutions across the United States, Native American women's reproductive rights, and issues regarding Native teen drug and alcohol use. Her activism ranges from removing Native mascots, bringing awareness to murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, water protectors, Indigenous identity, and protecting her traditional homelands in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from the extractive industry.
Thank you so much, Jahlina. Jahlina, would you start us off with our first question?
Yes, our first question is, earlier, we heard a land acknowledgement read by Dr. Cooper. Can you hear me? My audio is freezing.
Yes.
Dr. Bruchac, can you share with us why land acknowledgements are important?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And I think the best way to start is to explain that land acknowledgements are simply a first step in taking some kind of responsibility for our presence, not just your presence as a college or my presence as an Indigenous person or our presences as educators, but for our presence in Indigenous territory that is still unsettled land. Because for Native peoples, these are homelands that have been occupied for millennia. And colleges and other institutions are beginning to at least speak the names or try to speak the names of Indigenous peoples. And that first step brings a level of awareness that is not present in much of American society. Many people imagine that Native people are in the past and are gone, or that they are somehow primitive remnants of some former civilization that has been replaced by Euro-American settlers. That is not true, although it is true that Native people have been pushed aside, have been marginalized, have been stereotyped, and have otherwise been left out of much of our conversation about history and about place. So land acknowledgements are certainly not the only step, they're a step. And I think they've become popular in part, well, I think they've become popular for the same reason that using the term Native American has become popular. Because when I was a child, we were American Indians. And then Native American as a term came into usage in the 1970s as part of other human rights efforts. So Black power, red power, women's power. So that kind of visibility is always a first step. And it's very helpful to have that visibility in educational institutions, because hopefully people will unlearn many of the stereotypes that even Native people grow up hearing. And I'll just pause there and leave room for Rhonda to speak.
Yeah, I think that you answered that question beautifully, and we can move on from there. That's fine. I think we'll be answering that question over and over again throughout the course of the evening.
Thank you so much. Can I follow up with another question, please?
Absolutely.
Why have colleges and universities specifically begun using land acknowledgements?
And I think I've actually jumped ahead by starting to answer your question. And so, you know, I'll just sort of circle back to this for just a moment, because land acknowledgements are also a way of familiarizing ourselves with the names on this land. So you may have noticed that Dr. Cooper is still working on polishing up the understanding of how to say these names. And I find it really sad that the names that have been spoken, the languages that have been spoken, the understandings that have been known for millennia and for many, many generations in these places are not familiar to non-Native people. And in many cases, even Native people themselves are recovering their languages. So again, colleges and universities in particular, and also I would argue K through 12 schools, are places where we can encourage that kind of learning, that kind of understanding of Indigenous history, and also that kind of recognition that there's more than one language spoken on this continent. English is only the dominant language for the past few hundred years. But if we want to speak about true language dominance, we can speak about the multiple Indigenous nations who have been speaking beautiful, magnificent languages that are far more than just descriptive. They're languages that tell you who you are and where you are and how you are related to everything around you.
Thank you. I have a question for Ms. Anderson. Ms. Anderson, speaking from your role as a state commissioner on Indian Affairs, can you help me understand the following question? If campus is acknowledged that they are on Indigenous land, what, if any, legal or ethical liability do the campuses have?
First, pagalagisi anupak shinaga alak, tanok shinaga Rhonda Anderson, pangmakpak anu uranga korenami, shavaktunga Western Massachusetts Commissioner on Indian Affairs me, koyanak nalag nagipsi. Thank you for listening, Springfield community. I am speaking to you from Sakoki, Abenaki, and Pecumtuck traditional homelands in Coleraine, Massachusetts. And speaking as a commissioner and not a law scholar, I do not think that you have to worry about having a legal or ethical liability, but rather a moral obligation to acknowledge the hand that the educational institutions have played in the marginalization of Indigenous voices by disseminating settler colonizer history for centuries. And by omitting the full story of displacement and genocide, this continues the marginalization, oppression, and subjugation of Indigenous communities. Remember that colonialism is not a historical action, but an ongoing and even an intentional process. So asking me about legal obligations is kind of confusing to me. So surely you know about the doctrine of discovery and how that plays a hand in the sovereignty of Indigenous nations in this country. So a good example would be the Cheryl versus Oneida case of 2004, 2005, when the Oneida Indian Nation purchased land that had been a part of their original treaty land. They had sold that land off by the 1920s, and the Oneida had purchased this land on the free market and wanted to exercise their sovereignty on this land. The town of Cheryl argued that this land was in fact part of the township and demanded taxation. So our beloved Justice Ginsburg ruled in favor of Cheryl, using the doctrine of discovery against the Oneida, stating they could not reinstate sovereignty without putting the land into trust with the Department of the Interior. So unless the college wishes to renounce the doctrine of discovery and enter a land back agreement, I see no reason why there's so much fear about acknowledging that settler colonialism allowed Native people to become dispossessed of their land. A standard acknowledgement will not qualify for some radical land claim to take place, but it will serve well in the reparations and responsibilities of creating reciprocal relationships.
Thank you so much for that. So you just spoke about relationships. So as colleges and universities around the country start engaging around the issue of land acknowledgement, who should we be building relationships with?
So the college should absolutely be seeking reciprocity and relationship building with current local tribal nations who consider the land to be their traditional territories. Doing so recognizes and honors the sovereignty of tribal nations. Those relationships would include, now this is not my language, so I'm trying to, Chowbana Gungumog and the Hassinimesko bands of the Nipmuc Nation of Massachusetts, the Mohican Stockbridge Munsee tribal community, and the Abenaki of Southern Vermont. Other tribes in Massachusetts and unbordered regions, we don't recognize necessarily state borders. They crossed our territories, would include Mashpee, Aquinnah, Chappaquiddick, Herring Pond, Pocasset, and Seekonk bands of the Wampanoag tribe, as well as the Narragansett and Mohegan Pequot tribes to the south.
Perfect. So you mentioned a number of tribal nations. So this is a question for either you, Ms. Anderson, or for perhaps you, Dr. Bruchac. How do tribal nations view the use of land acknowledgements?
I'll just keep going. You must understand that Indigenous nations have done land acknowledgement since time immemorial. These acknowledgements are part of our cultural protocols even today, especially when visiting the land of another tribe. So I am a guest on this land, and I acknowledge that. Our many and varied cultures have one similar attribute. We are people of the land. Our identities and cultures are land-based. So Native people can see many acknowledgements as gratuitous and empty of recognizing tribes, tribal sovereignty, Native communities, their histories, and homelands. So there absolutely must be a seat at the table to have these conversations with tribal representatives when thinking about the creation of a land acknowledgement. There must be relationship. A land acknowledgement is not to leave Native people in the past, but to squarely address our survivance and contemporary issues. There must be an accurate history, current context, recent and meaningful action items created by those who wish to use the acknowledgement. To do this requires direct engagement.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Ms. Anderson.
And I'd like to add to that, because one thing that may not have been clear at the outset in the way we were introduced, Rhonda holds a formal position for the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs, and it is her role to serve as a liaison between institutions and towns and tribal nations in and across Massachusetts. I am speaking as an educator today. Even though I am Abenaki, I am not here in any formal position representing my tribal nation or any other tribal nation. But I say that because it's so important for institutions to recognize that simple fact, that it is not sufficient to simply find a few people who identify as Native and ask them to be spokespeople or liaisons or go-betweens. And many institutions make that mistake because it's difficult to tell who is in charge. I will give you an example. Quite recently, the Mashpee Wampanoag have changed their tribal leadership due to a pending legal case that has to do with lands and casino building, and the council has deposed their chairman. So if, for example, Springfield College were to reach out at this moment to the Mashpee Wampanoag and reach out to that chairman, they would be reaching out to the wrong person. So the most important thing in building relationships is to recognize that you are hoping to build relations with nations, not simply with individuals or families, which is not to say you should cut out individuals or families, not by any stretch of the imagination. And institutions must be supporting their Native students who often are isolated and often are far from home and far from their communities or struggling to find community where they are. But it's to give the basic respect where respect is due to Indigenous nations. And this is especially important in New England, where there has been so much erasure, so much misrepresentation, and so much duplicitous dealing, not just by colonial settlers, but by generations of educational and political institutions.
Thank you so much for that. Jahlina, why don't you ask the next question?
To either panelist, what can we do as a campus to ensure that a land acknowledgement is not just something that is read prior to an event?
I'll just very quickly make a couple of words on that. Is do your homework. Ask Native tribal leaders what they would like to see to come from a land acknowledgement. So basically ask tribes, what issues should you be elevating today? I'll leave it at that.
And if I were to add to that, I would say also to contribute some kind of resources to the people you are asking for something from. Because in many cases, tribal nations themselves are struggling to care for their own people, to care for their elders, to maintain their lands, to work on various legal issues, to conduct diplomacy with one another. And so sometimes multiple requests will come to tribal nations, to people who are working out of a borrowed desk in a side portion of their house with very little funds to draw on. And this is especially true for tribal nations that do not have federal recognition. So there's often the misperception that Native people somehow have vast resources and are waiting for you to call them and ask them for help. And that's certainly not the case in many cases. So this panel that we're doing now is a nice first step to just sort of open the door for thinking about the issue. But the appropriate diplomatic step is to open the door to sit down around the table and talk with tribal nations leaders about what happens next.
Thank you so much, Ms. Anderson and Dr. Bruchac. So it sounds like you would agree that land acknowledgements are a necessary first step to help us to understand the histories and places where we live, you know, especially as you spoke about the diversity and the issues within tribal nations. So are those land acknowledgements a good first step in helping us to build those relationships that we've been speaking about?
Absolutely. I'll just say very quickly and then let Marge take this away. She's the historian. Histories is understanding the histories and understanding the impacts of the histories on communities today and recognizing that. Very simple.
So to give the historical answer to that, the Connecticut River Valley is a very strange place when it comes to understanding histories of colonization, of colonial settler displacement of indigenous peoples, because it is what I sometimes refer to as the start of it was a soft colonization. And I say that only because there is historical evidence that Native people in and around Podunk, now Hartford and Windsor, Connecticut, and Agawam, now Springfield, Massachusetts, actually invited some colonial settler families to move here from Plymouth on the assumption that there were enough resources to go around, that it might be useful to have a trading post, it might be useful to have the English as diplomatic partners. And these Native people were watching very closely what was happening in Patuxet, Wampanoag territory, where the Plymouth colonists had arrived, and thought, well, you know, we can do better. But they had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that rapidly, in the wake of these first settler families coming, there would be the dramatic spread of disease to such a level that in Westfield, Waranoco territory, 1,000 people in a single village died within the course of a week. This was just horrifying. And this was, sometimes these diseases were intentionally introduced, sometimes they were accidentally introduced, but colonial violence was always intentional. And so what happened in this valley is that in the aftermath of those invitations came a series of negotiations that we tend to imperfectly call deeds. And deeds from the Native perspective were more like treaties, more like, let us write down an agreement or let us conduct diplomacy so we can live peacefully beside one another. And the understanding was that since colonial settler leaders were willing to give wampum and gifts and trade objects, that they were recognizing who had the status. And yet, once those words landed on paper, they became weapons to circumscribe Native territory and to re-identify it as a possession rather than as a place to live. And so you can map it out that proceeded up the valley step by step by step. Interestingly enough, Native people never signed over any of the falls where the anadromous fishing went on year after year. So around Holyoke Falls, Holyoke is an imperfect name, of course, but around Peskiumska, which we now call Turner's Falls, another imperfect name. But these places were regarded as communal indigenous territory where everyone came to fish. Wampanoag from the coast, Narragansett from what's now Rhode Island, Abenaki people from the north, Nipmuc people, all of these people shared these resource-rich locations and they never deeded them over. But the lands that were deeded, unfortunately, were rapidly settled by numbers of Native people simply could not imagine the density of the populations that would arrive. It didn't make any sense. Why would you leave one homeland across the ocean to move into someone else's territory? So the more that we understand of that history, the more that we teach of that history, it also gives the opportunity to really think carefully about what obligations everyone owes to Indigenous people. At the very least, respect for their sovereignty where they still are, where they still have control over their lands.
Thank you. It sounds like definitely, colleges that began to start thinking about land acknowledgements, it puts that seed, in the ear of those that are hearing it, for those students, those faculty, those staff, or those community members to say, yeah, I'd love to know more. Who were the traditional inhabitants or the native inhabitants on this land? And then I think hearing you, Dr. Bruchac, speaking about, the falls, and how they were communal, that is definitely new to me, and now I'm sort of biting at the bit to try to get more information on that. So thank you so much for sharing that. So thank you. Jahlina, I'll give it to you.
To either panelist, why do you believe there has been a failure to recognize the effects of colonial settler occupation on Native Americans?
Again, I'll start with that, and I just have one thing to say really quickly. I'm going to reframe your question. Lasting effects of colonization are evident with the inability to identify and reconcile settler occupation fully. So it is an uncomfortable issue to address. I mean, what is it saying? The victor gets to write history? So we are still taught history in a colonizer lens, while the Indigenous narrative is largely silenced. I think that speaks volumes about how I believe that there's been a failure to recognize the effects of colonial settler occupation. Take it away.
I think it has everything to do with how history is taught. I honestly don't think that the winner deserves the spoils, or even that the winner gets the spoils of history all the time. But whoever controls the press controls the news. Whoever controls the narrative controls the story. And I'll give you an example. I was just listening to a recording this morning of Alanisa Bomswin at Odenek, who is an amazing performer and historian in and of herself. And she began this recording by talking about a story of a woman at Missisquoi, which is Abenaki territory in present-day Vermont, who went down to the water, and a beaver came to speak to her. And the beaver said, "You have to leave." And the woman said, "Why should I leave? This is my territory." And the beaver said, "They are coming. You are in danger." And the woman's response is, "You're a beaver. What do you know?" And the beaver said, "No, I'm here to warn you." And Alani shared this story as an anecdote of why the Abenaki left their territory in what we call Indakina to go to Odenek, which was then in what was considered New France in Canada, in other people's territory. So another reason that we fail to understand is we fail to recognize where Native people were and where they are now as a result of either those warnings or those wars or those diasporas that forced them to relocate. So many Indigenous people are not in their traditional homeland at this moment in time. And I think that in itself is a profound failure of understanding.
Thank you to both for responding to that. So my question perhaps is somewhat based on these histories, or this lack of history that we've spoken about, or this lack of awareness around issues of colonization. So we've seen campuses as well as professional sports teams move away from Native American mascots. And this question perhaps is best given to you, Ms. Anderson. Why are these kinds of representation problematic for Indigenous populations?
Okay, why are these kinds of representations problematic? Well, mascots used by learning institutions and professional sport teams are hurtful and harmful, as they are inaccurate. They're stereotypical representations. And through these stereotypical representations, it erases the identity of Native people and generates stereotypes about what a Native person looks like, and again, portrays us as people in the past. These stereotypes and violent portrayals, because mascots are usually portrayed as violent, they create biases that dramatically affect our outcomes. And we have the highest rates of murder sexual assault, suicide, incarceration, and death from police brutality. I'm not trying to play oppression Olympics here, but these are the facts. And it can be really hard to visualize a future with yourself in it when facing this kind of erasure and this kind of violence. There's empirical evidence, decades of empirical evidence that shows the hurt and the harm of mascots, not only to Indigenous people, but to non-Native people as well. Mascots lead to these learned biases, these stereotypes, and they dehumanize an entire race in mainstream society. So I always say it's essential to learn how the rise of mascots began when Native children were removed from their homes and placed in boarding schools as a policy of intentional cultural genocide. And during that same time, non-Native people struggled to find a common identity in this melting pot country. And they chose to appropriate Native images to honor the warrior and the fallen savage. And that's giving a nod to manifest destiny. The control over our identity as Native people has controlled our outcomes. We are the only race that's used for mascots right alongside animals and chosen professions like cowboys and patriots, and races that are not oppressed minorities like Vikings, and imaginary beings like leprechauns. We are the only race used for mascots. We are the last accepted vestige of overt racism in this country. And I usually go so far to say even celebrated racism. So if we do strive to do anti-racist work, then we must do the work to dismantle systemic and institutional racism. And in today's climate of acknowledging and undoing racism, people must understand that the oppressions and marginalizations of any racial group are never acceptable. And we cannot and we should not overlook racism via mascots. So I believe that during this time, we're seeing a greater understanding of this simple truth. People are finally starting to see the connection between mascots and the inherent racism that follows. So I've seen it for months now. I'm doing the mascot work. We have seen close to 10 schools make that change, high schools. We have seen the Washington R-Skins get dropped. I've seen Cleveland Indians be changed. These are all things that have been challenges since 1968. That's a long time. It's slow to change, but I'm feeling grateful and I'm feeling like there's hope.
Dr. Bruchac, before you jump in, I do want to follow up to Ms. Anderson. So Ms. Anderson, some of the things that we've heard are that when sports teams or others have these Native mascots, they're actually celebrating the Indigenous populations or the Native Americans. What are your thoughts in terms of how people see this as celebration of the culture?
Well, when I say that it's a celebrated racism, we're the only race, where people dress up and go to the sports field with a feathered headdress, they do the tomahawk chop, the chanting, and I feel like this is a kind of celebration. And celebrating of what? What are we celebrating? Are we celebrating that Native Americans have faced intentional genocide and still survived? Or are they celebrating that they had been the colonizers that did this intentional genocide and they have won? What is it? I don't understand what their celebration is. And as far as honoring, it's not honoring Native people, especially when our 570 some odd cultures are being compressed into this one pan-Indian image that does nothing to serve the vast cultures and people that we are. No,
I'm
it's
just
not
going to jump
honoring.
in briefly because it's also, in a way, an odd form of stolen valor. Many of these stereotypes came about at a time when, quite honestly, white elite men and boys looking for some way to appear more, more proficient, more proud, more powerful, more athletic, adopted these stereotypes and grafted them onto themselves. So this was quite consciously done by the founder of the Boy Scouts. It was quite consciously done by the YMCA, even the YMCA at Springfield College. So these were not, none of these stereotypes were designed to honor Native people in the original form. They were simply designed to appropriate for themselves the imagery of a stereotypical Indian. That's why these mascots are always, well, I shouldn't say always, they are overwhelmingly male, they are carrying weapons, they are barely dressed, and they are violent. That is part of the point. They are appropriating that stereotype of the lone, violent Indian as an ideal for young white boys and men. And then when they become popular, suddenly everyone who identifies with that school or that sports team wants to claim that image for themselves because people develop an emotional attachment to these. It becomes part of their shared history. It's also why fraternal organizations, the classic example is the Improved Order of Red Men, who are not Native people, but are elite white men who adopt fake Native names and identities and form organizations, again, to aggrandize themselves. So I just find the argument that these are honoring to be completely specious, because if you were to reach out to the Indigenous nations in those places, you would find a very different answer to that question.
Thank you both for your candor. Jahlina?
Ms. Anderson, as someone who identifies as Indigenous, I have an issue with how we are portrayed in pop culture. How can our representation be improved?
Right, Jahlina, that's a great question, because when was the last time that you turned on the TV and watched a sitcom with a protagonist being a Native family just doing ordinary things? Or a commercial even with a Native family or a person doing mundane things like eating chips? When was the last time you saw a movie with the lead character as a Native person, not situated firmly in the past, or caricaturized doing stereotypical pan-Indian style activities? You know, how about turning on the radio and hearing a pop song from an all-Indigenous band? And would you even recognize that person as Native? So yes, our cultures are glaringly absent from mainstream society and mainstream culture. And that absence, I believe, is not an accident. On November 3rd, after the election, CNN showed exit polls on how each race voted: white, Black, Hispanic, something else, and Asian. Yes, we were identified as something else. And yet, Native votes clearly overturned red states in this election. So how can we improve our representation? By speaking up and by asking non-Native people to listen, by creating change in how we're represented. Support the bill in our Massachusetts legislature asking for a ban on mascots in schools across the state. So I do see change happening, like I said before, albeit slowly, but change is happening. Social media is a platform that has allowed Native voices to be heard loud and clear, and to center our current issues and our struggles, and to lift our cultures out of obscurity and into contemporary mainstream society. You know, I've used the word resilient in the past until a good friend of mine reminded me we shouldn't have to be resilient. We should have the same opportunities as everyone else. Why do we have to struggle twice as hard and come out resilient? To outdo our projected outcomes of not only survivance, but when faced with policies of intentional genocide and intentional cultural genocide, we should be products of determination. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
And I'd like to add to that, that another stereotype we haven't really talked about is the recognition that Native people are not Native because of how they look, but because of who they are and who they are kin to, and what tribal nations they are members of. So there is often the perception that there is a stereotype that all Native people must look the same, must have high cheekbones, must have raven black hair, must have some kind of fierce countenance. And that again comes out of fantasy, not out of actual history. Because in Native nations across the continent and Indigenous nations around the world, identity is determined by who your family is and who your kin are. So for example, there were studies being done in the South on what anthropologists were calling triracial isolates, who were people that had intermarried with freed Black families and Native families and sometimes poor whites as well. And many of them, like the Lumbee, identified as Indigenous people, and they are Indigenous people. And to give you an extreme example, during the French and Indian War era, it was common among Abenaki communities like my own and Mohawk communities to take English captives and adopt them as kin. And they were then considered Native. But again, these were considerations that were made by families and tribal nations, not by individuals. So what makes one Native is not an individual choice, but who you are, who your family is, and who claims you. And I'll just leave it there for the moment.
I know that Jahlina, you're up to ask the next question, but I do want to just acknowledge a chat that just came in because it is something that's striking. And the person says, to Jahlina's point and Ms. Anderson's response, the non-normalcy of Native representation is not accidental. A number of prominent early writers around literary issues unabashedly said, let's write exaggerated Indian tales to make US literary originals exciting and distinct from European literature. So it very much sounds like there's this social construct to Native Indigenous populations that was created to tell this tale. So thank you so much, Paul, for bringing that idea forward. And either Rhonda or Margaret, if you'd like to speak to that.
Well, and just briefly, the other part of that is the last of the Indian stereotype. So it was a fashion in the 19th century to identify people as the last of their tribe when they passed away, even if the town records showed that their sister and brothers and cousins showed up for the funeral. So that, again, that assumption that there is an Indian stereotype, and if you do not fit that stereotype, you do not exist. And then again, to point to the South, this assumption that if somehow you are of mixed blood, you cannot be Indigenous. And these are falsehoods that were created by eugenicists, by anthropologists, and not by Indigenous communities, who again, each had ways of determining who their kin were. So even if we bring in the issue of blood quantum was invented by the federal government as a way to limit Native entitlements, but it was not used by Indigenous communities until the early 20th century to limit their populations. And it's a very contentious issue even today. And just, I have to say on this issue of quote unquote race, race is a biological fiction, but a social and political reality. So it is not in the blood and in the bone. We are all human under the skin, but it is how we are perceived and how we are classed and how we are treated that pushes us into a racialized category.
Thank you. Jahlina, back to you.
To either panelist, could you explain for our listeners what is the most appropriate term to use? Indian, Native American, Indigenous, or do you have a different suggestion?
Well, I am Anupak, which is not, Athabascan is quote unquote Indian, but Anupak is not. We do not think of ourselves as Indian at all. Think of ourselves as an entirely different race. So I just want to make that that point clear. But I always like to paraphrase from the late great comedian and author Jim Northrup. He said when he was in elementary school, he learned he was an Indian. When he was in high school, he was taught that he was Native American. And in college, he found out he was Indigenous. But when he went back home to his Native community, he knew that he was Anishinaabe. So, you know, I am Anupiaq, which means the real person. And many tribes refer to themselves as real human beings or the place in which they come from. Again, having a land-based identity, that is who we are. Indian is a name that was a mistake and it stuck. And Native American is only referencing the colonized continent of Turtle Island and its current governance, the United States of America. So Native people have been here since time immemorial, long before the American government. First Nations and Indigenous terms will be more accurate terms if tribal identity is not known. If tribal identity is known, that is the most appropriate term to use.
I would just second what Rhonda said, because these are all imperfect terms, and yet there is this dilemma, and I counsel my students about this constantly, that if one intends to do research in the colonial era, one has to accept the fact that Indian will be the term that you will be looking for. And then if one is doing research in the 19th century, one has to recognize the fact that Native American in the 19th century did not mean Indian. It meant a white person who was the first generation born in this country. And so there was a Native American movement in the 19th century that was made up of white men and women who were determined to ship all Africans back to Africa, to ship all Native people out west to reservations, and then to send the Irish back to Ireland. So they were deeply opposed to anyone who was not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in descent. And even as we are coming up now to Thanksgiving, the most fraught holiday of the entire year, that is when we see this resurgence of glorification of pilgrim ancestors, which again is that hearkening back to people who are believed to be the destined inheritors of this continent that was already inhabited. So I say that only because it's easy to forget that all of these terms come along at different historical moments in time and they mean slightly different things. So there's a certain stage when you're doing research that you have to simply let them be as they are, knowing that they're all fraught. But then once you gain enough understanding, as Rhonda points out, if you know who someone is and what their tribal identity is, ask them how they want to be identified. And if you are not certain, attempt a rather neutral term like Native or Indigenous. But don't just assume that there is a single term that by any means encompasses all Indigenous people.
Wholeheartedly. And I just wanted to add, when I was in the UK last year, people just, I don't know, I guess I look enough something else. I was getting asked all the time, like, where are you from? And I'd say, oh, I'm a Anupiaq at the Baskin. And they kind of look at me. And I was like, I'm Native American. And there's still no recognition. And I say, American Indian? Oh, okay.
And they would say red.
So it's also this, yes. I mean, I actually had one fellow tell me over and over and over again, I must be Mexican. It's like, no, I'm not Mexican, but they are Indigenous.
Thank you both. You've given us so much to talk about and to think about in the last 45 minutes, but I want to just sort of piggyback off of a question I believe Jahlina gave us earlier in terms of understanding that if we do these land acknowledgements, they should not just be words that are read. So from either one of you, how can people take the appropriate actions based on the conversations we've had thus far and support Native American nations?
Well, just quite simply listen. Listening is the single most important thing you can do. I'll leave it at that. I don't know how much more I can add to that, but just listening.
It all depends on what the concern is. I'll just give you an example. I have seen many instances where, for example, an archaeological site is discovered and several things are likely to happen. One is that people may rush to salvage what they believe are relics and treasures. Another thing that may happen is people may rush to conceal it. I've actually witnessed this, unfortunately. Another is that people may decide to call the most prominent archaeologists they can find to gather what can be collected and put it into a museum. And then yet another, and these are all fraught responses, another is to write a petition and get a lot of people to jump on the issue and raise a lot of fuss in the media. And what I've seen over and over again, over 3 decades, is that the first step never is, and yet should be, contact the tribal nation. Because in many cases, there are Native people who are already aware of these disturbances. It's nothing new, it's been going on for generations. Or there are Native people who are in the process of privately monitoring sites to keep them safe from intrusion and keep them out of public view. Or there are already state or federal processes in place, whether it's site monitoring or consultation or whatever it might be. But so one does not want to rush to the extreme. So if anyone, whether an individual or someone in a position of power or an institution, wants to help, one needs to know what is appropriate and not simply adopt it. I apologize for saying this, white savior syndrome. It's not time to go riding in on horseback to save the poor Indians. It's time to put your horse in the stall and pick up the telephone and ask what is appropriate before doing anything.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. I appreciate that, because that is exactly what I've been doing for the past few months. Thank you.
Jahlina, I believe you've got our last question.
My last question is, what are some resources you could direct people to where they could get more information on Native American nations?
Well, I'd like to take this by doing a screen share, but Rhonda, if you have a thought, please go right ahead.
I'll just go very quickly. So in this day of information at our fingertips, there is no excuse for, ignorance. You may find easily tribal websites online. You can also find maps showing traditional territories of Native nations on the land that you're benefiting from at this moment in time. We have all of this information is here in our great, wild web. So go ahead.
To answer a question that came through the chat, and just to explain, we did not start this program by doing a full acknowledgement of every Native nation in New England, and I apologize for that. We could spend the entire hour and a half doing that kind of acknowledgement, but I'd like to direct you to a resource that Laurel Delano Davis and I put together that hopefully will address some of these questions. So this is the page that lists Southern New England Native American nations, museums, and organizations. It may not be a complete list. It is a list that we put together, but it's a start, because what it does is it directs you to each of these nations: Chappaquiddick, Chippewa, Eastern Pequot, Herring Pond, Mashpee Wampanoag, Mashantucket Pequot, Massachusetts Tribe of Punkapaug, Mohegan Tribe of Connecticut, Nipmuc Nation, Pocasset Wampanoag, Seekonk Wampanoag, Wampanoag Tribe of Gayheadaquina, and Narragansett Indian Tribe. This is only southern New England. This does not include Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. It does not include all of Connecticut. It does not include New York State, where we see the Haudenosaunee, and it does not include Canada. So Native nations were not constricted by present-day colonial borders. So these lists will always be incomplete. But that being said, this is a start, and these are Native nations that have websites. At the front of this site is a land acknowledgement that is a little more detailed than the one that was read to start. And I added to it an essay that is a beginning start to help people understand how Springfield and Agawam were settled. Again, this is not complete. The website was designed as, think of it as a portal. It's a place where people can begin to get more information. But most importantly, it also includes a link that answers a question that has been pointed out: what can you do? So right now, there are only 3 steps. They're very easy to follow. Take action on legislation. Look at the actions that are listed on some of these websites under resources and donate to organizations. So there's much more here, but as I say, it's a start. We also included a list of national Native American organizations, because these are people who I would say are on the front lines of issues that require attention and change. The Association of American Indian Affairs, for example, has been extant for decades. And the United Southern and Eastern Tribes is a collection of the federally recognized tribes along the Eastern Seaboard. And other tribes are part of that as well. And then state and federal agencies. So for example, if there is an archaeological discovery, one might want to first contact the Commission of Indian Affairs. Oh, guess what? Here's Rhonda Anderson. So you know who to reach out to. Or the Massachusetts Historical Commission. So the essence of it is pointing out that these resources are there. We just collected a number of them in a single location to make them easy to find, but it's not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. And it's a place to start.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ms. Anderson. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruchac. And thank you, Professor Laurel Davis Delano of the Sociology Department here at Springfield College for assisting with that informational website. We are going to get started with the question and answering period. And believe it or not, we have had questions rolling in. So we are going to spend the next 30 minutes responding to some of your questions. Please continue to put your questions in the question and answer box, and time permitting, we will indeed get to it. So let me get our first question. This first question goes to either of our panelists, and it's from Michael Crawley. Michael writes that I appreciate the idea of land acknowledgements as a first step. Could you speak on your perspective of what the ultimate goal should be, recognizing that it could be varied among different nations? So we'll leave that to either one of you to respond to.
I think anything we might say would be a personal opinion rather than a prescription. So my goal immediately following this presentation is to see Springfield College set up another webinar with tribal leaders across Massachusetts, but that webinar should come out of a table face-to-face consultation and exactly that, a consultation about what is the appropriate thing to do next. And I say that because, I think of a parallel example. The University of Massachusetts at Boston and at Amherst, they have had long relationships with the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs, with tribal nations in the state. They offer tuition waivers for Native students who are members of these tribal nations. The commission often helps to facilitate those. And so they are institutions you could learn from. And they take these relationships very seriously, even to the point where the University of Massachusetts Amherst created a residence hall for Native students on campus. Regardless of where they come from, they can have a place to live together. So I think Springfield College has a long way to go in developing relationships with the tribal nations in the state you reside in. And so if this is a serious first start, then that's an excellent next step. But beyond that, I would hesitate to tell you what any particular nation would want from you or the best way you should interact with them.
Thank you.
I echo what Marge was saying. Yes, I would not begin to, I already spoke to what some of the Native tribes in this area, how they view land acknowledgements. Beyond that, it would just be pure, personal opinion. So I'll refrain.
Perfect. Thank you. So the next question is from Kat Milo Bizark. If you are willing, can you speak to your opinion on National Day of Mourning and how to appropriately acknowledge or not the day known to many Americans as Thanksgiving? And that would go to either of our panelists, and it is an opinion question. There's passing the buck back.
The reason I hesitated is that I have a very strong opinion on this, and I'll explain where it comes from. So I spent the better part of 2 decades as one of many Native advisors to the Wampanoag Indigenous program at Plymouth Plantation. I served as a trustee of Plymouth Plantation for a number of years. And I was saturated in the historical and ahistorical interpretation of this fraught incident we call Thanksgiving. And so the National Day of Mourning that we're referring to is an activity that came about as a direct response to the erasure of Wampanoag people in Massachusetts and to the glorification of Pilgrim colonists. And I'm going to screen share because this is almost the best way I can explain it, is to show you this particular image, which is the Statue of Massasoit on the left. Massasoit is the sachem of the Wampanoag who created a peace treaty with the Plymouth colony in the 1620s. And at the right, you see the statue surrounded by Native people who have come out for the Day of Mourning. So the National Day of Mourning is a recognition that the colonization of the Americas started with the settlements at Jamestown and Plymouth. And had either of those settlements failed, we would all be speaking Indigenous languages. So it is such a fraught history. And the degree to which people glorify Pilgrim ancestors is so extreme that I'll give you an example. I was one of several consultants, along with my dear friend Linda Coombs, who is a Quinawampanoag, but I was one of several consultants on a National Geographic film that came out a while back, and also on a film called The Pilgrims that was an attempt to retell this history. And at one point, being interviewed in my role as a scholar, I said, perhaps we should be asking who the savages were. Were they the indigenous people who had lived here for millennia, or were they these people from across the ocean who had the arrogance to come in and take over someone else's homeland, who even had the arrogance to open graves and steal food left for the dead? Who were the savages? So I thought it was a very nuanced response, perhaps a little strident, but I received so much hate mail that the producers ended up removing that clip from the film because it was simply considered unheard of to suggest that perhaps actions taken by colonial settlers were savage. So this is the time of year when all of that comes to the forefront. But what keeps me hopeful and what keeps me alive is the work that Indigenous people are doing every day to resist that. So here you see Julia Martin on the left, Paula Peters in the center, and Linda Coombs on the right. And they are posing with a reproduction wampum belt that was created by Mashpee and Aquinnah and other Wampanoag people over the course of months of work to recreate something that had been missing but is now alive in a new iteration. And so the real emphasis at this time of year, any time of year, I believe should be on what Native people are doing to acknowledge the past, grieve the past, but then create new foundations for the future rather than simply emphasize the loss, because there is a point at which too much emphasis on loss takes the place of continuity. And I'll stop there.
I really can't add a whole lot. I am a guest here, and this is where this history began with Thanksgiving. So I really can't speak very much on the subject. I do wish that in our schools that there is education on the appropriate history, the true history, the Indigenous history. It's not the same as the history that we're taught. My own people, you know, it's Kuria Sugichi Kuya Vigami, which is Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving. So, you know, we celebrate our families, we celebrate our friends, we celebrate getting together and having the food that we eat. I do not celebrate a traditional Thanksgiving in that way. I don't think I ever grew up with like this traditional Thanksgiving that I think most other people in mainstream society think of Thanksgiving. So there's many different viewpoints from a lot of different Native American peoples. We all have different cultures. We all have different viewpoints. So that's also another question that's very similar to what do we call ourselves? Indians, Native Americans, do we celebrate Thanksgiving? I think you'll find different answers all across the continent.
And I think also, I apologize for the momentary rant there, but it seems necessary this time of year. But it's also really crucial to acknowledge the fact that Indigenous people have had ceremonies of Thanksgiving for the seasons of the year, for the various full moons of the year, for millennia. So in a strange way, the notion of Thanksgiving as a term has been co-opted in ways that really confuse matters.
Thank you to both. We have something of a statement that I'll go ahead and read that was presented in the Q&A box. And I believe it was in reference to a conversation or a question that was asked previously around relationship building. This statement or concept was presented or is presented by one of our listeners, Beth Madison. Beth says that as an example, the organization Soul Fire Farm has done work for years around these issues, connecting with Stockbridge Munsee Band of the Mohican Nation, which historically stewarded the land of Soul Fire Farm, which is now on the territory that was a reservation of northern Wisconsin. They are currently in the process of establishing a cultural respect easement, which would allow Mohican citizens to use Soul Fire Farm land for ceremonies, wildcrafting, and perpetuity. Additionally, we have native seed exchange with some of the farmers and herbalists in the communities, and are working with Mohican people locally on the fight to preserve their ancestral burial ground from development. So I believe this was a comment or a statement after Dr. Bruchac, you were speaking about the shared falls concept.
That's a wonderful example. And actually, Williams College has also just created a formal partnership with the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican. So that is something that institutions should really be considering, is can you create opportunities and partnerships with the tribal nations who are in your territory when you are in their territory? Are there opportunities or are there spaces you can offer or even perhaps relinquish? It's interesting, I followed a case quite recently where some lands were being bought for preservation in Chesterfield. And it occurred to me, wouldn't it be sweet if some of these lands purchased for preservation were offered to Stockbridge Mohican people? Because there we are heading into Stockbridge Mohican territory in the Berkshires, and yet they do not have a land base there because they are one of the tribal nations that was pushed westward to Wisconsin. So just thinking out loud.
And we just had a chat that just came up and it asked the question, and I can send this to either one of you. Are cultural easements enough? What about land redistribution?
Cultural easements and land redistribution. Cultural easements, that is a great way to acknowledge that the dispossession of land of the indigenous people of this area and allowing them to come back to the land for purposes of traditional medicines, traditional harvesting. You know, this is, as people who are based from land, this is how we heal. This is how we eat nourishing food that is right for our bodies. This is how we heal our bodies with medicines that are right for our bodies. So when you're dispossessed of your land, you're also dispossessed of your traditional subsistence foods and your traditional medicines. So absolutely, if there is a way for someone to have a cultural easement so that Native people can come and harvest from the land, I think that's a fabulous idea. Land redistribution, there is a movement called Land Back, where a lot of people I'm hearing about now are putting in their wills their land to go back to indigenous people. You can't take your land with you when you die. So redistribution is a great way to acknowledge, again, the dispossession of land of indigenous people. You know, Nipmuc Nation, they only had, and I could be wrong about this, but I think it was only like 5 acres of unceded tribal land that never left their hands. That is 5 acres out of something crazy like 20,000 acres. So you can imagine how grateful it would be to be able to hunt or gather medicine on land that is traditionally their territory, land that will recognize their words and recognize their bodies. I also saw in the chat that the wampum belt, the leather that created the base, that was by Andre Strongbear Gaines, and he is a young man who did the brain tanning and the smoking of that leather to create that foundation, and he is Nipmuc. So there was a collaboration across the state on that piece that went to the UK, if I'm not mistaken.
It's there now, and it will be coming back after display there. And yeah, and there are so many hands in that belt, it's impossible to name all the people. So the beads were created by Wampanoag artisans, and the weaving, and those just happen to be the 3 women I photographed it with at that moment in time. But I wanted to add to this, that to speak to Rhonda's statement about land, about the need to access these resources, the state of Vermont has recently acknowledged that Abenaki people in the state of Vermont have the right to hunt and fish without having to purchase licenses. This is huge, because this is something that the Abenaki Nation at Missisquoi has been fighting for decades. And so in Vermont, we have 4 state recognized tribes. So we have the Nulhegan Band and the Elnu and the Coas Abenaki and the Coasec, and of course Missisquoi. But so even when tribal nations are not federally recognized, they still can negotiate with the states they live in, and they should, and the states should recognize that, because honestly, nothing is lost. Sometimes people raise this fear of, oh, Native people are going to take the land. But as Rhonda points out, it's often a very small portion of land, and it's often more than overdue. So we really do need to be thinking honestly about what is possible in terms of reparations. What is possible in terms of making room? What is possible in terms of survivance?
Thank you. There was a question in the chat as to whether or not this would be recorded and made available to the public, and yes, it will. At some point in the very near future, this will be up on the Springfield College YouTube website. If you would like to send my office an email, we can get you that link immediately after it's done. Please direct your email to inclusion@springfield.edu. That's inclusion@springfield.edu. And we will make sure to let you know when the link will be up and where the link will be up. So thank you. We do have another comment or question from Brittany Wally. Brittany Wally, I believe, identifies as Nipmuc. So Brittany says that she suggests that anyone engaging in conversations concerning harm to Native people, like how Springfield College is, should also address any of their institutional structural systems that are problematic. Maybe there are some suggestions as to what systems these could be. So perhaps from Rhonda or for Margaret, have you worked with institutions to look at some of the systems that are in place that are hindrances to this work?
I yield to you, Marge.
There are so many ways to answer that question. I'm struggling for the right one. In an interesting way, this is going to sound like an odd critique. I direct a Native American and Indigenous Studies program. And in an interesting way, programs like that are similar to land acknowledgements in that they talk about the issue, but don't necessarily accomplish structural change. So when there is a Native population on campus, colleges and universities need to make room for people, need to make sure there is support for people. There is so much structural inequality and structural violence. It's one reason that so many Native people will go to tribal colleges where they live rather than go to other colleges. It's also why institutions like the College Horizons program came about to help Native students survive in college. Because statistically, Native people are less likely to gain higher education, less likely to achieve in their chosen professions. It really is an uphill struggle sometimes. And so I was thinking about that, but I was also thinking about what my colleague Laurel Davis Delano says about the social impact of structural inequality and structural racism and the routine nature of marginalizing and dispossessing and misrepresenting people that becomes just such an incredible burden, it can be difficult to overcome. And so at Springfield, I'll just take Springfield College for an example, is that from what I understand, your Native population is very small, but that does not absolve you of responsibility for supporting Native people in the state where you live. And it certainly does not enable the college to continue to allow the perpetuation of stereotypes or the misnaming of locales or the misuse of lands. So I am rambling here, but I'll stop there for the moment and leave room for another question.
Perfect, thank you so much. Well, that is it for our questions. We will just sort of pause for about 10 to 15 seconds to see if any other questions come in, and then we will offer any closing thoughts from our panelists. So we'll just wait a few seconds to see if any follow-up comes in. So we do have a comment and perhaps a question that came up in the chat. As a Palestine solidarity activist, I'm struck by how many parallel issues there are. Is there a connection between the work being done there and here? And I would assume that would go to either of our panelists.
I would say there are connections in that Indigenous people everywhere are suffering when they are dominated by another population that has moved into that locale. So whether we are talking Palestinian people, or whether we are talking Maori people in New Zealand, or Aboriginal Australians, that sadly, colonial settler domination is not limited to European colonies, that there are other forms of colonization, for lack of a better term, or domination that marginalize people who live in places where they are. So just, this is opinion, but I think it is also an ethical statement and a moral fact that people who have lived in a land for millennia have a right to be there and have relationships with those places, with the other than human beings in those places, with the ecosystems in those places, with medicinal plants, with every aspect of being in that place that enables the land and the people to survive together. And that occupation, colonial style occupation, does violence to all of those. It does violence to people, it does violence to the land, it does violence to all the other than human beings in that place. So anything we can do to enable the survival of Indigenous people in places also enables everyone's survival, because it is really about sustainable lifeways wherever we happen to be, that must include humane treatment of one another, that cannot include military domination and forceful oppression of one another.
Thank you. Okay, we do have another question. This question is from Chelsea Connolly. And Chelsea asked, what action items would you suggest be the first on the list? You know, we spoke a lot about where do we go, not just simply having this land acknowledgement, but what should we be doing? So I guess Chelsea's question is, what should be the first thing we try to accomplish?
Well, some action items, you know, these have to be meaningful action items that are place-based, and some action items that are kind of important to the Springfield College area is recognizing settler colonial terms that still do harm today, like Pioneer Valley. So Pioneer Valley, it does a great job in erasing Indigenous peoples, Indigenous history, and elevating settler colonial history. So there's no reason why we can't use Connecticut River Valley or Connecticut Valley. Like, that's accurate. But Pioneer Valley actually does some damage. In Massachusetts, there are 3 bills that are currently in legislation, and going to maindigenousagenda.org to look at these 3. Thank you very much, Marge, for looking at these 3 bills and how you can support them. I believe there were 7 pieces altogether, and I'm sure that in the next session, a lot of these bills will be reactivated. So going there and seeing how that you can support, especially the mascot bill, which is right now, we're hoping that it gets voted on before this session ends, so it can move on to the House, which is the end of December, so we're losing time. Making sure that we have Indigenous Peoples Day in your city, your town, your business, your school. You know, we don't need to be having a day for Columbus, I'm sorry. But we should be recognizing Indigenous people and turning over Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And of course, the change of the state flag and seal is also up in the Legislative House. Hoping that the Commission sees that we can change to a state flag and seal that we can all feel proud of. Protecting Native American heritage is a bill providing protection to Indigenous artifacts or items that are culturally sensitive, sacred. I was part of a group that picked up a pipe in Boston from an auction house that belonged to a medicine man. Oh my goodness. And it was such a powerful moment because it was recognized as a living being. So our items that go through auction houses, they should be repatriated back to the Indigenous tribes from which they were taken. They are considered living beings, quite often. So those are some steps that you can do easily, action steps for our area.
Dr. Bruchac, anything before we transition?
That's good.
Perfect, perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. Thank you to our panelists. Ms. Anderson, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruchac, for your expertise. We have had nothing but positive comments within our chat, and everyone really appreciates you for your time and your energy. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper, for staying with us and reading our land acknowledgement. And to my moderator, Jahlina Carter, a sophomore here at Springfield College. Thank you so much for your amazing job of co-facilitating this conversation with us this evening. As you heard, this will be available in the near future on the college's YouTube website. I believe that my colleague Lisa Holm has put that in the chat feature. So please, again, feel free to email us at inclusion@springfield.edu. Everyone, thank you so much for your time, and I will turn it over to Dr. Cooper, Ms. Anderson, or Dr. Bruchac for any final comments.
I just wanted to say thank you very much. What a wonderful program. I learned a great deal, and I love your passion and your commitment to others and to the land. It just was a wonderful evening. I would thank you for being a part of it, and your counsel. I wish you both well, and I hope your families are well.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper.
Thank you. Koya nakpak nalag nagirsi. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for having us here. Thank you.
Katsiolioni, Ulibom Kani, Linalwamwazi, in the language of this land. Thank you. Katsiolioni Skrempik Takik, to earth and sky and to all our relations, Miziu and Igwet. Ulinalawalmazi, be well, Ulibom Kani, travel well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic evening.